We feel like everyone should be taken for their own, who they are personally,
Yes.
not how they are as a group. And that's what's so dangerous about this profiling, and that's what's so dangerous about making a blanket law or a blanket legislation, because we don't believe, and I don't believe America believes, that a law, a blanket law, is a good deal for everyone. It's only a good deal for the individual.
And if you disagree out there and you're listening to this, try to think, if Christianity was not the majority religion in the United States, if somehow it was a religion that was basically practiced elsewhere outside of this country, and it was a minority religion, and then we had Timothy McVeigh, okay, would we start rounding up Christians in the United States who'd overstayed their visa? That makes it a little more personal, I think, and so that everyone out there can hopefully get it and understand it a little bit better.
That is such a wonderful way to portray that, Mark. The reason we have a Bill of Rights is not to protect the majority.
Yeah.
The majority doesn't need a Bill of Rights.
Exactly.
They are the majority. They've got political power. They've got clout. The beauty, the wisdom of the American system is through the Bill of Rights in the protection of the minority viewpoint. That's true of free speech under the First Amendment. It's true of minority rights. And you're so wise to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. I've often said to groups that I speak to, in about 2 minutes, if I interviewed someone, I could identify some minority they belong to. You know, whether it's a religion, a political party, race, gender, sexual orientation. So it doesn't take a lot to find that you are a minority somewhere.
Somewhere, exactly.
And if the heavy heel of government were ever used against your minority, then you would be sympathetic to what is going on with others.
As libertarians, we always say we're in defense of the tiniest minority, and that's the individual.
Exactly.
And I want to come back, because of all we've said, that in addition to what we've talked about under the USA Patriot Act, other things have happened since 9/11. The Immigration Service, shortly after 9/11, closed all deportation hearings in the United States. Now, our open court system is a bulwark of democracy. The right of the press, of the public, to walk into a public courtroom and observe government in action. And when this memorandum came down, all deportation hearings were closed. Now, that meant deportation hearings that had nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with national security, as well as cases that might have.
Now, why did they do that? I don't understand that.
They expressed generalized fear that in presenting the evidence for deportation, they might have to reveal national security secrets. Well, this is like, you know, killing a fly with a hammer. You could close, even in the old law, you could close an individual hearing if you could make a showing to the judge that there was national security.
If we have some people, military intelligence people overseas, they've gathered certain information, if that information was revealed, that would put them in harm's way. We certainly don't want that revealed, but we could already close it then on an individual basis.
Exactly.
So, but the across-the-board closure was challenged in court by Senator John Conyers and the Detroit Free Press, and in a wonderful, from my standpoint, decision that came down last August by the Court of Appeal in Cincinnati. It's Detroit Free Press versus Ashcroft. And in a historic opinion, they held that the press and the public did have a right, presumptively, to open deportation hearings unless the government could make a particularized case-by-case showing that a specific hearing should be closed.
I like it.
And in the course of that opinion, you know, sometimes judges stand up and are courageous against the government saying that they are being unpatriotic or disloyal. And this particular judge wrote a sentence I will never forget. He said, "Democracies die behind closed doors." And that's worth remembering.
Yes.
Now that case is being appealed, and it remains to be seen what will happen. So those are some examples. There have been heightened surveillance of internet accounts. There have been sneak and peek searches in which the government now can go into a home or office without the person being there, search their computers, download
without their knowledge,
hard,
without their permission?
Without their knowledge. What happened previously...
They can do this now.
They can do this under the USA Patriot
And they
Act.
do this, again, under the idea that they're using this against terrorists. But soon, they will start using it against everyone.
Because government, once its appetite is whetted for greater and greater authority, I've said that, you know, governments search for authority and power like roots search for water, and they're unquenchable in that search. And they taste the greater. You know, if you were master of the world and in charge, and the more power and authority you could aggregate to yourself, you would do it. The problem is that we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights to stand up against that. And I'm very concerned about these laws.
And it's very important that the government officials have power, more power than the individual. And law enforcement officials have power, more power than the individual. So it's always very important that they are operating under very strict guidelines and rules. Like you and me. You and me, we have to live by rules. We have restrictions on what we can do, and so should the government. But unfortunately now we seem to have this legislative anarchy where law enforcement, politicians, do not have clearly defined rules. They're supposed to be written down in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
And what's happened, we have other programs that you may have heard about or your audience may have generally read about. There was the TIPS program, Terrorism Information Prevention System. This was a system to have Americans spy on other Americans, to encourage the cable guy when he goes around your house, the water meter guy when he's on your property, if he saw anything suspicious, to report it to the government. Well, Americans are not trained and should not be pressed into service as spies on other Americans. And right after this was announced, down in Florida, you may have heard of a woman in a restaurant. She was sitting in a divider where 3 young Muslim men were sitting in the next booth. This was around the anniversary of September 11 last year. And she heard them talking about their plans and their arrangements. And she went over, she called the police. These young men were held for 17 hours. Their property was searched, their car was searched. What plans were they talking about? Their medical school plans in the fall and the facility where they were going to do their medical training. And unfortunately, they were fired from that medical facility for no other reason than this attention had been brought to them.
Have we not learned anything from the McCarthy era? Isn't this exactly, Stephen, what was happening in the McCarthy era?
Sure it was. And we've had dark chapters throughout American history.
Right.
We had the Alien and Sedition Acts during the Adams administration, when journalists who disagreed with John Adams in the expectation of going to war with France were jailed. We had the Red Scare, we had the Palmer raids, we had McCarthyism, and then let's never forget the internment of the Japanese.
Right.
In a very similar mentality, when the Japanese were thought as the other. The Japanese were the threat, the Japanese were the enemy. 120,000 innocent Japanese were put in camps, predominantly in California and elsewhere. And we look back on that time as a shameful chapter in American history.
We shake our heads, and yet we're doing the same thing.
And I ask audiences today, we are living it now. There were folks in their homes and in their workplaces during all of these eras. It's our responsibility today to see what is going on. I respect the idea that we need to be safe. There are certain inconveniences at airports and in other ways that we're going to have to
Can't
give
move
up.
about as freely as we'd like to anymore.
But as long as those things are done across the board and not in any way that's discriminatory or selective, I think all decent Americans of every faith and viewpoint want to contribute to that. but we are not made safer by the kinds of restrictions